Well, good evening, everybody. We are up to Fundamentals of Shooting 103, I believe, and tonight we will cover trigger control or trigger squeeze, whatever you want to call it, and we'll cover some of the basics of trigger and the trigger mechanism, and then we'll get into some of the fundamentals of how do you properly squeeze the trigger. I'm going to focus on rifle and maybe touch on a little bit of pistol, but I'm not going to touch shotgun. It's not my forte. Shotgun's quite different. It's more of a slap. It's a quick action versus rifle, especially bullseye rifle or bullseye pistol, is very focused on a steady squeeze. You want to break that shot and not change the movement of the firearm. So your trigger squeeze should be should be straight back directly in line with the bore axis. So first, the basic mechanism of a hammer. I'm going to show one that's many folks will be familiar with. This is a AR-15 hammer mechanism. Or trigger mechanism. You can see the hammer here. Here's your trigger. Here's your disconnector. This is what keeps you from going full auto. There's quite a bit more to it, but this basic disconnector is what latches after every shot. So I'm going to take that and move it out of the way for now. So here you can see on the hammer there is a little notch. All right, that notch meets with this beveled edge, the sear. That's the term to describe it. So the sear, as you pull this trigger down, it will break away from that and the hammer will move forward. So this is probably the most traditional of trigger mechanisms. You also have what's called striker fire. That's more common on handguns, and probably the most common handgun, a Glock that people are familiar with, uses a striker fire type of mechanism. It doesn't have a traditional hammer. The firing pin is actually just pulled back and it's under the spring. The firing pin spring is under constant tension when it's cocked, and then the sear releases the firing pin. So this is a little bit different. There is a floating firing pin in this setup that I'm talking about here. So that's the basic function of how the traditional Eugene Stoner trigger mechanism works. That has been improved upon considerably over the years. The two-stage trigger, which is more of a match bullseye target type trigger, is what a lot of people are familiar with now. They also have drop-in style triggers. And that's true of whether you're talking about an AR-15 or you're talking about, let's say, a Timney trigger that could go on a Mauser action, similar to the, I think it was the first week I did a demo with sight alignment on a 1917 Enfield, which is a Mauser style action. So there's all kinds of aftermarket triggers that you can get. Here's one, the Wisconsin Trigger Company. They actually have the rights to make the Milazzo Krieger two-stage trigger, which is the original one for the AR-15. I have one of those in my match rifle, and I got to tell you, it's probably the best upgrade I've ever done on a firearm. There is a dramatic difference between a GI style or just hunting rack grade rifle trigger and a match quality trigger. And if you're going to spend money to improve your firearm, there's optics are obviously one. If you don't have an optic, or you've already got a good optic, then a trigger is an excellent place to start compared to the cost of, let's say, a match grade barrel and having a gunsmith rebarrel rifle for you. Optics and triggers are two places you can spend money and really improve upon the capability of the firearm. So with that said, I will show you a different two-stage trigger. This is actually a Rock River Arsenal two-stage trigger. It's similar to the Milazzo Krieger, but it does not have, and I know it's very hard to see, I apologize, but it does not have a sear release mechanism like you do on the GI Eugene Stoner trigger. So if you recall down here on a standard GI hammer, you had this notch where the sear would catch and release. Here you have a notch for your first stage, and then right here, as you depress, because of the angles, the geometry changes, this will actually control your second stage of release. So you have take up. So as you start to pull the trigger, you will have an initial, I'm going to just pick some round numbers. These are adjustable. This particular one is adjustable. You might have 2.5 pounds of pull, and then the last little bit of pull may only be an additional 1 pound. And so that gives you, 2.5 plus 1, so you have a 3.5 pound pull. That's a really good quality trigger. I can't recall off the top of my head. A lot of there's a lot of rules. Let's just leave it at that. Depending on your matches, what requirements there are around trigger pulls. I used to shoot some matches that were 4.5, and then you could shoot a bench rest, which you could breathe on the thing and it would go off. Speaking of triggers that you can breathe on and go off, that brings to light another style that you may have heard of, which is a set trigger. And a set trigger actually, it has two distinct modes really. You have the standard pull, which might be a 4-pound trigger pull. Or you can set it, and there's a couple different ways to set it. Sometimes I've got some that you push forward, others which have two triggers, a set trigger and then your trigger which you fire. In either case, a motion or a movement of a mechanism is required, which will dramatically drop the weight of that trigger pull. So I've got a CZ rifle, a 550, that has a single set trigger. So there's you push the trigger forward actually, and that lightens the trigger down to about 1.5 ounces. It's really, really light. I use that when I shoot rifle matches with it, but when I'm hunting with that same rifle, I don't want to use a set trigger. You don't want that really, really light trigger when you're hunting. You want to have a little bit more buffer, I guess, before the rifle goes off, and a little bit more control. You generally don't want a really, really light trigger for anything other than target applications. So the basic fundamentals of a good trigger pull, it's got to be steady, it's got to be directly in line, so it's got to be straight back, and there's a couple things like take up, which is a term that folks might be familiar with. That is certainly more important when you have follow-up shots. So if you're shooting a service rifle match and it's timed, you want a cadence, and part of that cadence will be the take up. So as I pull this trigger, I'm going to do it from this side. You will notice it moved, but it didn't go off yet. So that's the initial take up, and it's also the weight of this first stage, because this is a 2-stage trigger. And the last little bit is when it will go off. Now, as we follow up from a shot, you'll notice this hammer, because this is a semi-automatic, the bolt would come back, it would reset that hammer to the disconnector. Now, I'm pulling as hard as I can, and it's not going off again because it's not fully automatic. I have to release the tension, and did you hear how it reset? So that reset, and now it will, as I apply pressure, the hammer will cycle again. So watch this one more time. So the bolt comes back, I release the trigger, it resets, and now I can apply pressure again. So the take up is this initial distance and initial weight, and then that second stage is just that last pound and a half before it goes off. And you wanna also make sure that where you are putting your finger on that trigger, it's consistent. Consistency is absolutely key. Whether it's how you hold the firearm, whether it's how you put the pad of your finger on the trigger, there's debate over that. The key thing is, however you put that trigger finger on there, you want to be consistent and you want to make sure that you're pulling straight back in a uniform way. There's a couple schools of thought on, whether or not you pull the trigger, keep it back, follow through on the shot. And follow through means I take the shot and I don't roll off. I maintain, I recoil and I maintain position, cheek position on the firearm. I maintain, a controlled grip. Now, some people who are critics of that, they'll tell you, oh, well, you want to quickly release your trigger, not necessarily come all the way off. I did right there, but, come forward enough so that it resets faster and you don't have this noticeable click. If I come off of it a little bit and come back, notice you didn't hear the click because I actually had the trigger fully released. Some of the critics of those, they shoot more rapid fire. They're in a tactical type of mentality. For basic target shooting, hunting, I think personally follow through is far more important. Of course, my background is shooting black powder where you've only got one shot, so you got to make it count. And if you don't follow through with the shot, you have a tendency to develop bad habits. I mentioned rolling off. That's one way, but maintaining that focus through the shot, completely through the shot, will actually help you be able to better call your shots. And by call your shot, that means, hey, if I pulled it a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left, I not only know that it went right or left, I know how far it went right or left. I know it went 4 inches or it went, just a smidge. So how do you develop that level of confidence and capability and repeatability? Dry fire. Dry fire, dry fire, dry fire. And what is that? That means basically you are practicing with an unloaded firearm, so you want to make sure it's fully cleared, you don't have any ammunition around it, and you set a target out, on a wall, either a small reduced size target, or if you can look out the window and you're like me and your neighbors aren't close by and it would be nerve-wracking for them to look through the window and see you dry firing there. But it's a simple target, a little dot on a wall, and it's perfectly safe for most firearms to dry fire, so to let the hammer drop, here. I generally wouldn't do this without the upper assembled, but just for demo purposes, I'm not hurting anything right now. You'd never want to do this, however, with a black powder firearm that doesn't have something on the percussion nipple. And you can just put a little washer, a rubber washer or something like that on there, a little piece of cut off rubber hose. Or the other thing that you never want to do that on is rimfire, so like a .22 long rifle. You will actually, the firing pin will strike the barrel itself, around the chamber, in many instances on many .22 long rifles. So if in doubt, ask a gunsmith, ask a friend who knows what they're talking about, if it's okay to dry fire a particular firearm. But dry fire will help you develop the muscle memory. It will help you focus on the fundamentals, and you don't have the loud concussion and the bang, which is frankly distracting. And when you don't have that loud concussion or bang, you will start to pick up on things that you were doing that are counterproductive, like rolling off on the shot or flinching, for instance. So that's tonight. I know I was going to focus on triggers, talked about some other things like dry fire, but hopefully this was value added for folks. Have a nice night.